Now, let's talk about big ideas. I think this is really, really important. We're thinking about your specific passage in developing a big idea. A long time ago, a seminary professor at a Baptist seminary named John Broadus said this: unity in a discourse is necessary to instruction, to conviction, and to persuasion. You must have unity in a discourse, meaning a sermon is not like a shotgun shell going off, where you got 800 thoughts going in 800 different directions. A sermon is like a rifle shot going off, where you got one thing that you're trying to drive home. If you want to have conviction, instruction, persuasion, you've got to have unity. Here's my observation from listening to preachers and hearing what people think about preachers. A lot of times people listen to a preacher, church members, and they come away saying, well, it's too deep, I can't understand it. And I listen to the same guy, and I say to them, I don't think it's too deep at all, I think it's too scattered. Right? That can be true for a sermon, that can be true for a Sunday school lesson. People come away confused, I don't understand it. He seemed to know what he was talking about, but I couldn't connect all the dots, I don't make sense of it. That's not that the teacher or the preacher was just brilliant and over everyone's head. That's that he didn't do the hard work of drilling down a big idea, a main idea, and driving it home. He wasn't clear in his communication. And it's sad that people walk away from that kind of sermon or Sunday school lesson thinking, well, I guess I'm too dumb to get it, because I just can't understand what he's talking about, but he seemed to know. The real problem is not in the audience most of the time. The real problem is in the communicator most of the time, is that they haven't drilled down to a big idea. So how do you develop a big idea? The stuff that we're about to talk about here, I'm just telling you right now, is a little bit abstract. But it's really important for you to think about this process, okay? When you're developing a big idea, you're asking the question, what is this text about? What is it about? Step one, read the text. Are you seeing a theme here? Read the text. You got to start with the text. You do not develop a big idea saying, you know, I've been wanting to talk about this. You come to the text and you're saying, I need to find what the big idea of the text is. Not what my big idea is, but what does the text say? So you start by reading the text. And listen, you remember what we heard earlier from Stott? We was talking about good Bible study. You come open-minded. Don't read the text assuming that you already know what the big idea is. There's a lot of time in my sermon prep where if I sit down and I'm lazy and I jump the gun and I try to throw a big idea down and then I do the work of studying and reading, where I come back and say, yeah, that wasn't even close. That's not what that's about at all. Don't assume you know what it is. Read the text. Second, find the immediate subject of the text. What is the subject? In my sermon prep, this usually boils down to one word. One word. So this week, I'm studying the passage is John 17, 1-5, the first part of Jesus' high priestly prayer. And I'm starting with the text. I'm going to read it. I'm not going to read it 50 times, but I'm going to read it. And then I'm going to say, what is the subject? Okay? The subject of that text is glory. And it took me a little while to get to that, because my first thought is it's prayer. He's praying. The subject is prayer. That's not what that section of verse is really about. It's really about glory. And for a long time in my sermon prep this week, I had on my Microsoft Word document, big idea, ... glory. That's just the subject, but that's where you start. Okay, what is the subject, the immediate subject of the text? Thirdly, discover what the text says about the immediate subject. You're looking to the text, what's the subject, and what does the text actually say about the subject? Look, this is really easy when you have a short passage. Like if you're preaching one verse, I'm going to give you an example in a minute, it's pretty easy with a single verse. John 17, 1-5, it's a pretty short passage. You don't have a lot to wade through. But if you're preaching a whole chapter, you got a lot more to wade through to say, what is the one thing that this is about? The one subject. And what does this passage say about that one thing? What does the text say about the immediate subject? If you stop right there, if that's it, all you have is a statement about history. A statement about history is not a big idea in a sermon. A statement about history means you have dug down in the biblical world. Now your job is to build a bridge from the biblical world to the world that we live in. Okay? And so, step 4, abstract the subject of the text so that the audience can relate to the subject. In your sermon, you are not just trying to give information about the past, you are trying to give timeless truths to God's people. So you got to drill down in the Bible world. What is the subject? What does this text say about the subject? And then you've got to abstract those ideas into the real world. And I've given you some examples here, okay? If I said to Corey, I want you to get up and give us a talk about Eric Clapton. Some of you may be immediately interested in that. Some of you may have absolutely no interest in that. Some of you may know a lot about who he is. Some of you may not know who he is. Corey could immediately just jump in about Eric Clapton, and he could say, well, he was born at this time, and he lived in this place, and he could give you all the specifics or the details. Or he could abstract it a step up and say, well, he's a guitarist, so I'm going to really talk about Eric Clapton, the guitarist. Or you could abstract it one more idea and you could say, I'm going to talk to you about Eric Clapton, the musician. All of a sudden, Mark, the pianist, is cueing in. I don't care about Eric Clapton. I don't care about guitars. That's Tyler's thing. But music, now you've brought in more people. You've abstracted it one step. You could back it up a step and say, well, he's an artist. Lots of different art forms. This is one of them. He's an artist. You could back it up and say he's a human. Okay, I'll give you another example. Kansas Jayhawks. A lot of you don't care about the Kansas Jayhawks. Some of you are wearing Texas Tech stuff tonight. It's despicable. It's distracting me and I don't like it. But we could abstract it one step and we could all talk about college basketball. Or some of you could say, I don't like college basketball because none of those guys can make a shot. Let's just talk about basketball. Brings in the NBA. Brings in upward basketball. We're talking about a big category here. We could talk about team sports. We could talk about sports, and I'm going to come to this Abraham example here in just a minute. Okay? Step 1, read the text. Step 2, find the immediate subject. Step 3, what does the text say about the immediate subject? Step 4, abstract the subject so that the audience can relate. Step 5, discover what the text says about the immediate subject that applies to the desired level of abstraction. This is where you build that bridge from the Bible world to the real world. Okay? Take your Bible and let's look at one example of this process. Look at Genesis 15:6. Now again, I told you this is pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy when you're looking at a small passage, when you're looking at one verse. The longer your passage gets, the trickier this becomes. We're going to start with the text. Some of you are like, Genesis 15, I know what that's about. Don't read into the text what you think it's about. Okay? Start with the text, not your own ideas. Genesis 15:6 says, he, you just stop right there. And he. Who's the he? This means context matters. So you got to go back. It's about Abraham. Okay? Abraham, he believed the Lord, and he, this is where syntax and grammar and words and vocabulary, all this stuff matters. He doesn't mean the same thing in every place. This is the danger of just looking words up in a concordance. You can find all the occurrences of the word he. They're not talking about the same thing. You can find all the occurrences of the word love. They're not all talking about the same thing. He believed the Lord. Abraham believed the Lord. Lord in all caps, Yahweh. And he, grammatically that's a reference back to Lord. The Lord counted it to him, that's Abraham, as righteousness. He believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Step 1, read the text. Step 2, find the immediate subject of the text. So you look at this and you say, okay, maybe it's about Abraham. That he is at the beginning. Maybe it's about Abraham. But if you say that this text is about Abraham, then all of a sudden it's not about the Lord. So that kind of cuts out half the verse. So then you flip and you say, well, maybe it's about the Lord. Then that kind of cuts out Abraham. That's half the verse. So you're bouncing around saying, okay, what's it really about? What's the one thing it's about? You can't say it's only about the Lord because it's also about Abraham. You can't say it's only about Abraham because it's clearly also about the Lord. So you're wrestling with this and you end up saying, okay, the subject has got to be the relationship between the Lord and Abraham. That has to be the one thing that this verse is about. If I'm preaching this verse, the one thing it's about, it's not just the Lord, it's not just Abraham, it's about the relationship between these guys. Now, what else does it say about that relationship? Well, it says two things about it. It says first that Abraham believed the Lord. That was his side of the relationship. And it says the Lord credited or counted to him that belief as righteousness. So Abraham did something and the Lord did something in this relationship. Abraham believed and the Lord counted it to him as righteousness. So we know what the subject is. We know what the text says about the subject. If you stop right there, you're just a historian. You're not a preacher. That's just looking backwards. Okay? You've drilled down into the text, but now you've got to abstract this thing and you've got to move forward. So how are you going to abstract this? You can't abstract the Lord because I can't give you a little flow chart like this with Eric Clapton that has the Lord on it and how you abstract the Lord. That doesn't work. So maybe the part that we abstract is Abraham. And that's where you come back to this right column and you say, okay, Abraham, that's the historical guy back in the story. Move it up a level. Well, he's a patriarch. Any of you patriarchs? No. Well, that's not particularly helpful. I'm still stuck in the Bible world. Back it up again. Abstract it another level. Well, he's an old covenant believer. Any of you guys live in the old covenant? No. Still stuck in the Bible world. Well, let's abstract that one more step and let's think about the people of God just in general across covenants. Now we've got a touch point all of a sudden. Because now you say, I'm one of those. I didn't live in Ur, and I didn't speak Hebrew, and I didn't have all these experiences with the Lord, and I wasn't a patriarch, and I wasn't in the Old Covenant, but I am part of the people of God. People who have a relationship with God. You've not changed the meaning of the text. You've abstracted part of the story to a level that is now relatable to somebody today. Okay? So you abstract it back to Abraham, and then you're saying, what does this story say about the relationship between Abraham and the Lord that might also apply to the relationship that all of God's people have with the Lord? Now you're moving towards a big idea where you're actually taking something from the Bible, historical truth, you've drilled down in the Bible world, and you're building a bridge into the modern day world, and you're connecting these two worlds. Look, in one verse, I've cherry-picked a relatively easy one. The longer your passage is, or the more obscure your passage is, sometimes this takes some work to actually think through. What is the one thing that it's about? And how can I abstract part of this truth so that there's a connecting point in the modern day world that we live in? What's the universal truth that we can apply today? Here's the benefits of going through this process when you're preparing to preach. Number one, a big idea tells you what to include in your sermon. And secondly, a big idea tells you what to exclude from your sermon. And any of you who have taught or preached know that the first one's important. You need to know what to put in. The second one is more important. You got to know what to take out. Because your sermon is not to be like a shotgun blast where you say, I learned 80 cool Bible facts this week and I'm going to regurgitate them on my audience. And next time they play Bible Jeopardy in Sunday school, they are going to win. and it's going to be awesome. That's not a sermon. That's Bible Jeopardy. That's trivia hour at the bar. Your job is to say, what is the one thing that this is about? And I'm going to drive it home to your life. That means some of the stuff you come across in study has to get cut out. When you do this, as a teacher or a preacher, this is one of the hardest things that you have to do, is cut stuff out. Because studying is fun. I hope you think it's fun. I think it's really fun. And you get into it and you're like, that's interesting. I didn't know that. That's fascinating. I can't wait to tell people this, and they're going to think I am so dadgum smart. Well, they're probably going to leave thinking you're not a great preacher, or you're just too smart for them and they can't understand, or they're a little bit confused. That's not the aim in any of it. So you got to know what to include. You got to know what to exclude. Last, a big idea promotes clear communication and audience comprehension. This is why most Sundays I just straight up tell you, here's the big idea. I just want you to know what it is, and then we're going to work on it. And you can think about this like a circle, okay? You start at the top with the text. You're moving in your study to find what is the big idea. Then as you prepare your sermon, it's all centered on that big idea. It's still controlling the text, the big idea of that text. You found it in study. It's controlling your sermon prep. It's part of your delivery. You just say it out loud, and you finish that circle so that in your sermon you're trying to bring people back to the text so that they're not just taking your word for it, but they're seeing it in the text themselves. And when you do the hard work of this, finding it, letting it control your sermon, bringing people back to it in your delivery and helping them see it in the text themselves, most of the time people walk away saying, well, that seems really obvious. How did I never see that before? Well, it's because you did the hard work of connecting all those dots and then showing them the truth of God's word straight from the text, okay? So you've got to go through this process when you're preaching an exegetical sermon. You've got to go through this process of finding a big idea.